Chapter 13. Micklepage Farm. The smell of death and devastation haunted the streets of Whitechapel. Buildings smouldered. The charred body of a dead cat lay amongst the rubble, nothing left on its black, dehydrated remains to say if it had been Ginger or White or Tabby, somebody's pet, or a feral alley cat. It was not only cats and dogs that lay dead under the scorched bricks. Residents and shopkeepers picked their way through the debris, greeting neighbours, asking in quiet voices who had survived last night's raid and who hadn't. It was December 1940. London was suffering some of the worst bombing of the war. At the mission, preparations were being made for the evacuation of the Pom's children and their nanny to a Christian mission in Sussex. Brown cardboard cases were packed with clothes and favourite toys. The children, bundled into their warmest jumpers and coats against the cold, were labelled in case they got lost. Mrs. Poms was to remain with her husband to help him with his parish work in the East End slums. Ruth was given full responsibility for the safe transport and well-being of their 6 children. Joan, a strong woman in her early 30s, with hair hidden under a floral headscarf, met them from Horsham train station and helped them up into the back of her pig lorry. They sat on bales of straw placed there to provide them with seats. The smaller children's feet dangled in the air, and they clutched at each other as the lorry swung round bends on the 5-mile drive down the narrow, winding roads. Ruth held tightly onto the baby, afraid that she might be flung out of the back. At their feet the bag slid from one side to the other on the dirty floor. At last they turned into some farm gates. Joan called cheerfully over her shoulder, "We're here, children. Welcome to Micklepage Farm." Ruth's first impression was of the smell. Not the smell of burning buildings, not the smell of war and death. These were warm, pungent country smells, living animal smells. Still, she wrinkled her nose as she jumped down, her city shoes sinking ankle-deep into the icy, squelching mud. Joan, helping the children down from the truck, looked round at Ruth's gasp of dismay. "Ha! I see we'll have to find you some Wellington boots, Nanny." She looked closely at Ruth. "Refugee?" Yes. From Germany? Yes. Good. Everyone welcome here. We have another German woman, Sonia. Helps Mary, our cook, and sews for us. Introduce you later. She hauled their cases and bags from the truck. "We all muck in here, do what needs doing. Although—" She looked at the 5 bewildered children standing in the muddy yard and at the baby cradled in Ruth's arms. "You'll have your hands pretty well full with this lot." Straw had been spread along the path to sop up the mud. They progressed gingerly towards an odd assortment of buildings. The older children wrinkled their noses, surreptitiously nudging each other and giggling. Joan pointed out a barn-like structure with a large wooden cross over the door. "Chapel. Used to be a cart shed. Only converted last year. Over there's the refectory, that big barn. We all eat together. You'll all be sleeping in the hostel over there, Nanny. Washrooms round the back. Come on, children. I'll show you where your beds are. You can stash your belongings and then go to the refectory. It's Mary's day off, but Sonia will warm some milk for the children and make a nice cup of tea for you, Nanny. She makes excellent biscuits, by the way. Prayers at 5. Micklepage, a 13th-century farm near Nuthurst in Sussex, had been bought in 1935 by Joan, a graduate in agriculture, and her friend Beatrice, a psychology graduate. They'd met at Reading University and had been converted at a university mission. They had established a Christian retreat at the farm. The plan was for mothers and children from city slums to be able to experience the countryside away from the poverty, violence and awful tenements in which many still lived. Originally, Micklepage had no affiliation with any particular church, but by the time Ruth arrived, there were strong links with George Gibson, the vicar of the Anglican Church of St Hilda's in Camberwell. Franciscans, Quakers and Plymouth Brethren helped to establish the community, and many distinguished members of the clergy, including the bishops of Southwark and Chichester, visited as guests and were very supportive of the venture. The Bishop of Chichester, George Bell, was a strong opponent of Adolf Hitler and his government in Nazi Germany. He condemned the persecution of Jews and gave his support to any leaders of the German Church who resisted Hitler. He was active in the campaign to help German refugees and in bringing German anti-Nazi clergy to England. As the children of a German refugee pastor, Micklepage was clearly the best place for the Pom's children to be evacuated to when they left London. Ruth helped the children to choose their beds and pushed their cases underneath to be unpacked later. "Come, Kinder, come, children, it's been a long journey. Let us find a place where we can have a warm drink." "I'm hungry." "Ah, of course you are, Liebling. We all are, and I'm sure they will be finding us something to eat. Come." The woman working in the refectory kitchen was in her mid-30s, plump and black-haired, with a prominent widow's peak and fierce, dark eyes. "Sie sind schmutzig." "You're dirty, filthy. Always I have to wash the floor. Take your muddy shoes off at once." The children hurried to obey. "You," she pointed a fat finger at Ruth's shoes, "leave them outside my clean kitchen." Ruth felt intimidated and disappointed. This was probably the only other German-speaking adult here, and she felt as if she had made an enemy of her already. "Entschuldigung, excuse me, I'm sorry, of course." When all their shoes were standing in a neat dirty row outside the kitchen door, she introduced herself and the children. "Are you Sonia? Joan said you cook here." "I cook, and it's hard work, I can tell you." "Joan said you make very good biscuits." Suddenly the fierce eyes softened. Taking a big biscuit barrel down from a high shelf, she placed it on the table in front of the children. "Come, eat. I made them myself this morning." "Could they have some warm milk, do you think? They're very cold." The eyes hardened again. "I'm not your servant. I am not waiting on you. Here, a pan there. The milk. Do it yourself." As Ruth began preparing the milk for the children in the unfamiliar kitchen, Sonia became friendly again. "And you, what would you like?" "Tea would be nice. If you could tell me where it is—" Sonia's face suddenly took on a sly, conspiratorial air. "But you would prefer a strong cup of coffee, I think, yes?" "Ach, ja," Ruth sighed at the memory. "But I have had no real coffee for a long time since— not since I left Germany." "Today you will have real coffee. I know somebody in London who— But never mind. Do not ask me from where I buy it." Soon the children were tucking into warm milk and biscuits, and their faces took on a rosy glow. The kitchen filled with a bitter aroma, bringing memories of the coffee houses of Berlin and Dresden. Relieved to be speaking in their native tongue, the two women sat and exchanged stories of how they escaped from Germany. It took a few days for the little family from Whitechapel and their nanny to fit into their new surroundings. The children missed their parents, and the little ones cried and needed a lot of comforting. It was a full-time job for Ruth to care for their emotional well-being as well as their physical needs. Clothes had to be washed. They got much dirtier in this place of endless mud than they ever had in the bomb dust of London. Their shoes and boots needed constant cleaning, as did the children themselves. The older ones could bathe themselves, although somewhat reluctantly, but Ruth still had to bath the little ones. She worked hard, long hours, but found time to read them stories at bedtime. At night, When at last she had finished all her chores and joined in the prayers that were an integral part of Micklepage, she sank into her iron bed with its hard horsehair mattress and rough woolen blanket with such relief that the mattress might have been made of feathers and the blankets a duvet of softest down. But although her body relaxed, her mind was often in turmoil. Worry often prevented her from sleeping. Anxiety about her brother, who was a soldier, about Hans Werner, now locked up in an internment camp somewhere in England, and about Hans Werner's mother, perhaps still in hiding somewhere in Berlin. Tears were not foreign to her pillow on that lonely bed. During daylight hours, the farm animals occupied the older children. This was a completely new experience for them and for Ruth, always the city girl. Other members of the community encouraged them to help with feeding the pigs and chickens, egg collecting, and even milking the cows. There were other children to get to know, for there were whole families living in various cottages on the farm. Soon the fear and stress of constant bombings eased a little, although night after night they could still hear planes overhead on their way to London. Eventually everyone settled into the routine of the community. "Please, Nanny, can we go and see the barn cats?" Ruth suppressed the impulse to say no. There was a glutinous bog between the farmhouse and the barn. This would mean another batch of washing the sticky mud from their clothes. Her hands were already raw from scrubbing their clothes with harsh soap, and chapped from mangling and hanging them out on the cold washing line. "Why don't you go and join the other children? They're making palm crosses and corn dollies and other Christmas decorations from straw. You could make some too. It would be fun." Much to her relief, they took her up on this idea, and for once the prospect of more muddy laundry was averted. Christmas at the mission was celebrated on Boxing Day with a special service in the barn chapel. Many visitors from the local community and beyond joined them for the day. The old barn was filled with the aroma of fresh straw, spread so deeply that the children had difficulty in wading through it. Everyone, adults and children alike, sat in the straw before the manger altar, made of a heavy Sussex oak, with an iron tethering ring fixed in its side. Ruth was fascinated. She had never experienced such a thing before. She was used to going to Christmas services in splendid German Baroque cathedrals with huge organs and finely trained choirs. In spite of the generous covering of straw, it wasn't that comfortable sitting on the floor, but the atmosphere and warm feelings generated by the whole congregation singing together impressed her. Voices were raised to the accompaniment of a breathy old harmonium. The well-worn hymn books smelt musty, their pages damp with mildew, but the sound of carol singing, the smell of guttering beeswax candles, and the sight of the celebrants pressing their hands in blessing on the heads of the children gave the occasion an aura of calm and continuity in those uncertain times. By the time the service was over, the coarse straw had gouged patterns into aching knees. At last the candles in the chapel were snuffed out, and everyone gathered in the farmhouse around the huge kitchen table. Food was served on a strange assortment of plates and dishes. Cooking smells mingled with the smell of ash and cinders from the roaring fireplace. Ruth found herself seated beside Sonia's son, Alec, a bright, mischievous boy in his early teens. He had been born in Germany and escaped with his mother after his father had been killed by the Nazis, but his command of English was already impressive. He enjoyed teasing Nanny, and Ruth took it in good spirit. On her other side was a good-looking young man who barely spoke throughout the meal. When she tried to engage him in conversation, he blushed to the roots of his gold-blonde hair. Ruth exchanged glances with Alec, who sniggered and whispered in German. "He's terribly shy. Fancies you, I expect, hübsche kleine Ruth." Pretty little Ruth. "Quatsch, frecher Junge," Nonsense, cheeky boy. Introduce us. Alec leant forward. Switching to English, he said, Wilfrid, have you met Ruth yet? She is nanny to the Pons children. Ruth Schmidt, Wilfrid Green, farm worker and conscientious objector. What is that? Ruth asked, not understanding the expression. Alec switched to German again. Pacifist, won't fight, not even the bloody Nazis. Ruth wasn't sure whether to be shocked or impressed. At least, she thought, he had the courage of his conviction against all the pressures of young men to join up. She thought that Wilfrid was someone she might like to know better. It's difficult for me to imagine the man my father was when he and my mother met for the first time. I know he was a good-looking boy in a blonde, very Aryan kind of way. He was 4 years younger than Ruth. He was very shy. He never lost that. What it was that attracted Ruth, she was never able to tell. By the time I asked her, any feelings she had had then were long forgotten. January brought heavy snowfalls, and for a few days everything was white and soft. Snowball fights and the making of snowmen and snow dens occupied the children from dawn to dusk. Then the icy wind froze mud into iron ruts, and footsteps crunched through a crust of snow. By 3:30 every afternoon, when they came in for tea, the children's faces were wind-whipped and tingling. Cheerfully ruddy faces gathered around the kitchen table, eager children devouring huge amounts of bread, margarine and jam, and the room was filled with chatter. The weather changed. Heavy rain fell for days. Snow disappeared and the remaining slush turned the farm into a quagmire. Ruth was sickened by the ever-present smell of the soggy woolen coats hanging in the porch. She spent most of her time indoors, helping to prepare food in the kitchen and joining Sonia in the endless darning of socks. It was a relief to be able to speak in German. Over several months, Sonia learned her story and sensed the loneliness that Ruth tried so hard to hide. Hans Werner she dismissed as a hopeless case, and was brutally blunt when she told her. If he would have wanted you, then he would by now have made you a promise, a proposal, especially now you are both in England. You must realize this. Ruth didn't want to believe it, but she bowed to the older woman's experience. Yeah, you're probably right. Of course I am. Now, you are a pretty young woman and you need a boyfriend. There is a young man here at Micklepage who would make you a fine husband, and I'm sure he likes you. Ruth was surprised and a little embarrassed. Who? Why, Wilfrid, of course. Haven't you noticed that whenever he sees you, he blushes? Yes, but, well, I thought he was just a bit, shy, perhaps. Ah, Ruth, you're such an innocent. To you he is very attracted, of that I am quite sure. Ruth carried on darning for a while, weaving the coarse grey wool over a hole in the heel of the sock, which is stretched over a wooden darning mushroom. She finished repairing the sock before she spoke again. But to me he has hardly spoken, she said at last. But you like him, yes? Ah, Sonia, I don't know. I don't really know him. But he is attractive, yes? That blonde hair, those blue eyes, a good-looking boy, and he works hard. He's a trained engineer draftsman, you know. When the war is finished, he'll get a good job. Ruth thought of her dark-eyed academic Hans Werner. Not handsome in the conventional sense, but so right, and to her so very attractive. She sighed. Wilfrid is not my type, I think. Ah, Ruth, you're not getting younger. You love children. Don't you want a family of your own? How old are you now? 27. Well, Wilfrid is a bit younger, I think, but that doesn't matter at all these days. There will be few enough young men by the time this war is over. So began Sonia's campaign of matchmaking. Ruth was alone and vulnerable. Wilfrid, at 22, was only too willing to have an attractive German girlfriend, especially as he knew it would upset his very conservative Victorian parents almost as much as his refusal to fight. Sonia was a powerful persuader. It was all enough to ensure the match. By the time summer came to the little community in Sussex, Ruth and Wilfrid were regarded by everyone there as being a couple. I think that at some time during 1941 the Pons children returned to London. Perhaps their parents could not bear the separation any longer. Ruth decided to stay behind. Perhaps by this time there was already an understanding between her and Wilfrid. Without a job, she needed to find an occupation. She found it in Horsham with a well-known local family, the Lintots. They had 2 little boys in need of a nanny. William was about 5 years old, his brother David a little younger. Ruth truly loved those little boys and hoped that one day she would have a son of her own. After she left them, she corresponded with Mrs. Lintot until she died, and then to William right to the end of her own life. Wilfrid and Ruth had some problems in communicating, which Ruth had put down to language difficulties, as her English was still not very good, and Wilfrid had no knowledge of German. Young people always find other ways of making themselves understood. Ruth wrote to Hans Werner and told him that she had had a proposal of marriage, and the reply she received put an end to all her hopes and dreams of a future with him. If she wanted to have a home, husband and children, she came to the conclusion that Sonia was right. She should accept Wilfrid's proposal. They were married in the spring of 1942 at St. Andrew's, the little church in the village of Nuthurst. I have 2 photographs of that day. My mother was dressed for the occasion in a dark suit with knee-length skirt, a white blouse with something, perhaps a brooch, pinned at the collar. She wore stockings and dark shoes, and had a circle of white flowers in her hair. It was not a conventional outfit for a wedding, although in those times of war it was probably quite common to use whatever best outfit you already had. But that bright circle of flowers against her dark hair made her look special. My father wore a light suit with wide trousers and lapels, a white shirt and mid-toned tie, dark socks and shoes. They had their reception at Micklepage Farm. In the group photograph, I can identify Wilfrid's parents, his father looking quite jolly, but his mother rather sour-faced. They didn't approve of this marriage. Behind his mother is Wilfrid's sister Molly, who was in the Women's Land Army during the war. They're surrounded by adults and children from the mission farm. There is nothing in my mother's face to suggest that the day was anything but a happy one for her.